Hi, everyone. Welcome to the online portion of the training course on nature-based solutions for disasters and climate resilience. It's our great pleasure to welcome you all to the course. As with all online sessions, please feel free to stop and go back to any concept or terminology that you are not familiar with, and you can repeat the session as many times as you like. Now let's get started. Session 1, Fundamentals of Disasters and Climate Resilience. So, by the end of this session, you should be able to understand the related basic concepts and terminology of disaster risk trends, climate change and disaster, early warning systems, and other terminologies. You should be able to explain the differences between disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, and disaster resilience. In addition, we'll be looking at some of the latest trends, such as the anticipatory actions, and how that actually can fit into the overall community's resilience. Now let's take a look at this picture. This is an earthquake in a very remote area. So, is this earthquake a disaster? Let's think about it. Now, if your answer is no, you are correct. Earthquakes, like other extreme natural events, occur naturally in all parts of the world and are referred to as natural hazards. There's no way for us to stop a natural hazard from happening, but when people's lives and livelihoods are destroyed, then natural hazard will become a disaster. So in the picture earlier, an earthquake in a remote area where there's no people, no houses, no infrastructure, that is not a disaster. So when we're talking about disaster, we need to talk about the risk of disaster. So we define disaster risk as the potential loss of life, injury, or destroy or damage assets which could occur to a system, society, or community in a specific period of a time determined populistic as a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity. As you can see from this diagram, the intersection of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability with your disaster risk. So when we talk about disaster risk, it is often demonstrated in a function of hazard, exposure, vulnerabilities, and capacity. Now let's look into each of them in details. Now let's look at hazard. A hazard is a process phenomenon or human activity that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social economic disruption, or environmental degradation. When we look at a hazard, there are actually three different types of hazard. Natural hazards. These are naturally formed phenomena, just like a storm or typhoon, or anthropogenic, which basically a man-made or socio-natural, which is a combination of natural and anthropogenic. Hazards, of course, include various types. When we talk about different types of hazards, we have hydrological hazards such as typhoons, hurricanes, cyclones, floods, etc. Then you have the biological hazards, such as bacteria, viruses, or parasites. Then you have the environmental hazards, such as the soil degradation, deforestations, loss of biodiversities, etc. And you have the geological or geophysical, such as earthquake, volcanic activity, and landslides, rock slides. And you have the technological, which is basically industrial pollutions, nuclear radiations, or toxic waste. After hazard, exposure. Exposure actually means people, property, systems, or other elements present in hazard zones. They are thereby subject to potential losses. And vulnerabilities, basically the conditions that determined by physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase the susceptibility of an individual, a community, and assets or systems to the impacts of hazards. And the last component of the disaster function is capacity. A capacity is a combination of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available within an organization, community, or society to manage and reduce disaster risk and strengthen resilience, as you can see on the disaster function. Capacity is a denominator. So capacity is sometimes described as the opposite of vulnerability. But this kind of definition overlooks the fact that even poor and vulnerable people have capacities. Indeed, the starting point for capacity development is the existing knowledge, strength attributes, and resources individuals, organizations, or society already had. So there are actually four types of vulnerability and capacity: social, economic, physical, and environmental. Social vulnerability and capacity. Social vulnerability refers to the potential negative effects on the community caused by external stresses on human health, disruptions in the availability of services, or damage to the built environment. These stresses may result from disasters or human-induced changes. Some populations may be more susceptible to harm due to factors such as age, income, education level, and other social and economic factors. A great example of social vulnerability is the difference in access to healthcare between low-income and high-income communities. A great example of social capacity is education. If people are educated and are more aware of disaster risks and the potential impact, they will be better prepared. Economic vulnerabilities and capacity. Economic vulnerability in the context of disasters refers to the susceptibility of an economy, whether at the individual, community, or national level, to suffer damage and loss in the face of a disaster. This vulnerability is primarily determined by economic resilience, or its capacity to absorb shocks and recover from them. An example of this is a coastal community that relies heavily on tourism, and when there is a storm or typhoon, that will certainly have a greater impact on them. For economic capacity, we can look at insurance as a great example of such capacity, or government-sponsored capacity, or government-sponsored findings or responses to disaster are another great example of economic capacity. Physical vulnerabilities and capacity. Physical vulnerability to disaster pertains to the potential for physical damage to buildings, infrastructure, and natural environments. Due to an event, this can depend on several factors, including the intensity of the hazard, the design and the structure of buildings and infrastructure, and the effectiveness of existing mitigation measures. So a great example of the physical vulnerability is building in a seismic zone. When the earthquake strikes, this building will be damaged by the earthquake. Another great example of physical capacity is if these buildings in the seismic zone are retrofitted so they can withstand an earthquake better than the last type of vulnerability. The environmental vulnerability and capacity. Environmental vulnerability refers to the ability of a natural environment to be damaged and degraded as a result of natural or man-made disasters. They can significantly disrupt ecosystems, leading to loss of biodiversity, erosion, and water and air pollution. A good example of this is when we have soil degradation in a coastal zone, and a great example of the environmental capacity is looking at planting mangroves that can actually protect the coastal area from erosion. Now, we understand how the different components of a disaster risk works. Let's look at the formula one more time. So, in order to reduce the disaster risk, we have to somehow increase the capacity, at the same time decrease the vulnerability exposure. As we cannot change natural hazards, we cannot prevent natural hazards from occurring. So, when we are talking about disaster risk reduction, we are actually talking about the reduction of exposure to disaster. We are talking about the reduction of vulnerability to disasters. At the same time, we're talking about increased capacity to manage and cope with a disaster. Now we know what a disaster risk is. Let's look at the disaster risk management. Now, this is a famous diagram that actually illustrates the different phases in the disaster risk management cycle. Before we get into that, let's look at what is disaster risk management. Disaster risk management is the application of disaster risk reduction policies and strategies to prevent new disaster risk, reduce existing disaster risk, and manage resident risk, contributing to the strengthening of resilience and reduction of disaster losses, and so on. The diagram you can see, there are 4 different phases in the disaster risk management cycle. You have the prevention, mitigation, and preparedness. These are the activities that you can do before a disaster strike. Then you have the response, recovery, and reconstruction phases. These are the activities that you do immediately or right after a disaster event. So when we're looking at the pre-disaster phases, these include mitigation or prevention and preparedness. As you can see, we usually don't like to use the prevention because that actually gives you a false hope that you can actually prevent a natural hazard from happening. So that's why we usually focus a bit more on mitigations rather than looking at prevention. So when we look at mitigation, that can actually be divided into two different types of measures: structure and non-structure, to mitigate the risk of disaster on a long-term basis. When we talk about preparedness, these are the activities and measures taken in advance for an effective response to the impact of disasters. As I mentioned earlier, there were two different types of mitigation measure. You have the structural and non-structural. So for structural mitigation measure, we usually talk about dams, we talk about the flood levees, we talk about the ocean wave barriers, earthquake-resistant constructions, and of course, with disability in mind, accessible evacuation shelters and route that are able to be used by person with disabilities. Now, when we talk about non-structural mitigation measures, these can refer to institutions, legal systems, or strategies to mitigate the impact of disasters. This can also mean land use planning and its enforcement, research and risk assessments, understanding the potential impact and information and public awareness, and most importantly, a culture of safety. When we are talking about preparedness, if you look from this picture, that person is able to put out the fire with a modern equipment, or it means that they have the training and the necessary equipment for them to actually be prepared for a fire. So, when we're talking about preparedness, we usually refer to the various different activities that are related to food, shelter, and health. And the preparations can be applied not only to our lives, but they can also apply to our livelihood, which also includes livestock and agricultural products. You can also talk about security. It's also very important to mention gender issues and social inclusion. Looking at the vulnerable groups within our society, how can we actually help them to be better prepared for disaster? And there are some activities that are exclusive to a certain type of hazard. For example, flood preparedness. You need to have shelter in place. You need to have a risk map. You need to have early warning system in place to warn the incoming flood. And you need to have an understanding of the vulnerable groups, such as the elderly, the young, the disabled, how to help them, evacuate during a flight event. The same applies for earthquake, landslide, and fire. They are very unique activities and preparedness measures that specifically address those hazards. Now, let's look at the post-disaster phase, and which includes response, recovery, and reconstruction. Response means the actions taken directly before, during, or immediately aftermath of the disasters. This could be dispatching a search and rescue team, stockpiling relief supplies right before disaster strikes, and looking at how the community research and response team can help the local communities in the first 24 hours of disasters. For the recovery and reconstruction, these mean the process of maintaining or reestablishing vital infrastructure and systems following a disaster or human-induced disasters. These are usually long-term and require a large number of resources for you to reconstruct society after a disaster. So the cost for recovery is more expensive and painful than the cost for preparedness. So that's why it is always very important to be better prepared than to pay for the response and the recovery after a disaster strike, so earlier. We mentioned the disaster risk management. It actually uses the word disaster risk reduction, or DRR. So what is disaster risk reduction? Disaster risk reduction is aimed at preventing new and reducing existing disaster risk and managing residue risk, all which contribute to strengthening resilience and therefore to the achievement of sustainable development. So simply put, the disaster risk reduction is looking at policies and strategies. It's looking at plans and programs. It's looking at community-based disaster risk reduction, and BENT. It's looking at public-private SME partnership to prevent and to reduce disaster risk. So, going back to the formula earlier, when you have an increased capacity, that also means a reduced vulnerability, and you will have a reduced disaster risk. And that will actually lead you to have less damage and less losses. And this is probably the word that you've heard a lot recently, is called resilience. So resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, to absorb, to accommodate, to adapt, to transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. This is including through the preservations and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions through risk management. Now you understand the definition of a disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, and disaster resilience. So, why do we need to focus a bit more on the activities and the measures you can do before a disaster strikes? Because costs now, based on research done by the United Nations, every $1 invested in prevention could save $7 in recovery. And that is a very good return on your investment. So, what is the relationship between disaster risk management and sustainable development? Actually, they're linked very closely to disasters at often devastating costs to societies and communities in terms of financial losses, destruction of infrastructure, and loss of lives. They can set development back for years. At the same time, environmental destruction and lack of sustainable development increase disaster risk and impact. So it is critical, as you can see from the diagrams, that they actually work together in terms of disaster risk management and sustainable development. Now, we are understanding the difference between disaster risk management, disaster risk reduction, and disaster resilience. Let's look at the big picture. For over 30 years, the focus really has been on response, but now everybody is talking about disaster reduction and preparedness. So, there is definitely a shift in thinking over the years. So let's look at them in detail. So there is definitely a shift in thinking from response to prevention. Traditional disaster risk management focused primarily on responding to a disaster once this has occurred. Today, there is an increased emphasis on prevention and mitigation and identifying potential risks, planning for them, and taking steps to reduce them. There's also from silo to an integrated approach. Disaster risk management was seen as a standalone issue addressed separately from other aspects of social and economic planning. Today, it is really recognized as a cross-cutting issue that should be integrated will mainstream into all aspects of planning and development. There's a shift from top-down to a bottom-down approach. Early years, when we're looking at disaster risk management, is often relied on the top-down approach, where decisions were made by the central authorities. Now, there's a shift towards a more participatory, bottom-up approach that involves local communities in the decision-making process and recognizing the unique knowledge and insights. And there's also shift found a single hazard to a multi-hazard approach. There is a recognition that communities often face multiple interconnected risks, and this has led to the development of multi-hazard approach that assess and manage this risk in a more holistic manner. There's also a shift from short-term to long-term thinking. Disaster risk management has moved away from the short-term temporary solutions to focus on the long-term sustainable strategies for risk production and community resilience, and there's a shift from physical to socio-ecological systems. There's an increased recognition that the disasters are not just about physical hazards, but are deeply intertwined with social, economic, and ecological systems. The shift is reflected in the concept of social, ecological resilience, which emphasizes the interconnectedness of human and nature systems. Last but not least, there's a shift from risk to resilience. While risk remains an important focus, that has been a shift towards building resilience. This involves strengthening the capacity of communities to withstand and recover disasters and to adapt and transform in response to changing conditions. As we are talking about the DRR concept, we would like to give a definition that UNDRR provided to make you understand more about DRR. Disaster risk reduction, DRR, involves strategies and actions to reduce the risks and impacts of disasters, including natural hazards like floods, landslides, earthquakes, and droughts. It focuses on understanding and managing risks to minimize human and economic losses. UN 2021. Let us learn more about the key principle of DRR and its importance. Key principles of DRR are the following: prevention, proactive measures to avoid or reduce disaster risks, e.g., land use planning; mitigation, reducing the severity of disaster impacts through structural, e.g. flood barriers, and non-structural, e.g. early warning systems, measures. Preparedness, building capacity for effective disaster response, e.g. training, evacuation plans. Response, immediate actions during and after a disaster, e.g. rescue operations. Recovery, rebuilding and restoring affected areas while enhancing resilience, building back better. And its importance, reducing losses. DRR minimizes human casualties and economic damages, with 90% of major disasters in the past 20 years being weather-related, IUCN 2017. Enhancing resilience, strengthens community capacity to withstand and recover from disasters. Supporting sustainability, aligns with global goals like the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and climate adaptation efforts. The Asia-Pacific Disaster Report, APDR, 2024, by the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, underscores the escalating disaster risks in the region, particularly in South and Southwest Asia. The report emphasizes the urgent need for transformative adaptation strategies to address these challenges. Over the past 5 decades, South and Southwest Asia have experienced more than 1 million fatalities, incurred $485 billion in economic damages, and affected 3 billion lives due to disasters. The region is witnessing an increase in the frequency and intensity of climate-related hazards, including droughts, floods, heat waves, and surface winds. These hazards are emerging and intensifying, posing significant threats to communities and economies. Specific areas, such as the Ganges-Brahmaputra-Meghna Basin, Indus Basin, and parts of Turkey, Bhutan, and Nepal, consistently emerge as hotspots for intensifying multi-hazard scenarios across all climate projections. Critical ecosystems, including mangrove forests, are under increasing pressure, jeopardizing regional resilience and biodiversity. The degradation of these ecosystems diminishes natural buffers against disasters. In the figure, it will show the total affected from disasters in the South and Southwest Asia, 1970 to 2024, and total damages from disasters in the South and Southwest Asia, 1970 to 2024. Here are the example of disasters and their impacts. Bangladesh floods. In August 2024, heavy rains and upstream water from India caused flash floods in 11 eastern Bangladesh districts, affecting 5.8 million people and displacing over 500,000. Floods submerged roads, farms, and fish ponds, damaging 296,852 hectares of crops and causing $156 million in fisheries and livestock losses. Over 7,000 schools closed, disrupting education for 1.75 million students, UN OCHA 2024. India, floods and landslides. Extraordinary rainfall over 72 hours triggered eastern India's worst floods since 1983, affecting 1.7 million people, displacing 117,000 and causing 26 deaths. Over 2,000 landslides were reported worsening the damage. Northern India also saw deadly landslides since late July, UN News 2024. Maldives flood. Between late December 2023 and mid-January 2024, unseasonal heavy rains caused severe flooding in Malé, Maldives, damaging 140 homes and disrupting airport operations. Record rainfall on December 31st submerged parts of the capital and impacted livelihoods and infrastructure, including disruption of the airport, UN Maldives 2024. Nepal, floods and landslides. 1. Severe floods and landslides in Nepal since late September 2024 have killed 250 people, injured 178, and left 18 missing. Nearly 1,500 homes were destroyed, affecting over 1,000 families. Damage estimates include NPR 4.35 billion to energy, NPR 2.5 billion to transport, and NPR 6 billion to agriculture. Over 30,000 responders rescued 17,120 people. Widespread damage to critical infrastructure has worsened humanitarian needs, with heightened risks of disease outbreaks in overcrowded camps. The government has declared 71 municipalities across 20 districts as disaster crisis zones, UNRCO 2024. Now, let's move on to another very important topic that is shaping our world today: climate change. Climate change and environmental degradation are some of the greatest challenges facing humanity. Beyond direct environmental impacts, Climate change has serious developmental, economic, and humanitarian implications. Climate change is altering the face of disaster risk, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. It leads to change in the frequency, intensity, duration, and timing of extreme weather and climate events. It also causes increasing sea level and temperature rises, but climate change is also increasing societal vulnerabilities. For example, from stresses on water availability, agricultural and ecosystems, the IPCC predicts that climate change is likely to slow economic growth, erode food security, and exact poverties in most developing countries. For more than a decade, development and humanitarian practitioners have been advocating for an approach that integrates disaster reduction and climate change adaptation to build resilience in a sustainable way. Disasters and climate change both have similar consequences for people's lives. There is significant overlap between the problems that disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation seek to address. Disaster risk reduction covers non-climate-related disasters such as earthquakes, but it also addresses climate-related disasters such as floods, droughts, cyclones, and storm surges. With climate change predicted to increase the frequency and/or intensity of climate-related hazards, populations already exposed to those hazards and effects will be at greater risk. Populations exposed to hazards may also experience stresses due to long-term changes in climate. For example, changes in seasonality, unpredictable rainfall, and sea level rise can affect livelihoods and health, making people more vulnerable to all types of shock events. And further changes when we are talking about climate change, climate events. We have to talk about early warning systems. So what is early warning system? It is an integrated systems of hazard monitoring, forecasting and prediction, disaster risk assessments, communication and preparedness activities, systems and processes that enables individuals, communities, governments, businesses, and others to take timely action to reduce disaster risk in advance of hazardous events. And I'm sure that you probably have heard the end-to-end and people-center early warning systems. The difference between end-to-end or people-centered early warning systems and regular early warning assistance is that there are actually 4 new dimensions to the end-to-end and people-centered early warning system. One of them is the dimension of disaster knowledge, which is based on the systematic collection of data and disaster risk assessment. There is a new dimension in the detection, monitoring, analysis, and forecasting of the hazards and possible consequences. There's a third dimension of disseminations and communication by an official source of authorities, timely, accurate, and actionable warnings associated with information on the likelihood and impact. And there's a dimension of preparedness at all levels to respond to the warning received. And the latest terminology is anticipatory action. What is anticipatory action? Anticipatory action refers to actions taken to reduce the impact of a forecasted hazard before it occurs or before its most acute impacts are felt. These actions are carried out in anticipation of a hazard's predicted impacts and are based on forecasts of when, where, and how the event will unfold. The actions allow for more effective delivery. The FAO has calculated that every dollar they invest in anticipatory action could give $7 in benefits and avoided losses. We'll have a detailed session on the anticipatory actions and their applications within the arena of community resilience during the face-to-face portion of this course. Now, if you look at the diagram, this is actually taken from the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asia Nations, a regional framework on anticipatory action. It really shows you how and where these actions or the anticipated actions can take place before a disaster strike, and the potential benefits that you can bring in terms of the reductions of the impact or the traditional responses that you will need without this anticipatory action. Now we take you to the end of the session. Again, since this is a self-paced session, you have the ability to rewind, to go back to a certain point of the presentation, to listen to a certain terminologies or concept to get a better understanding. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attentions and a goodbye.